introduce Peter Sterling, who's giving a special seminar here today. There's so many things he asked me not to say that I had to write down what I was allowed to say. So Peter, for many years, Peter was a practicing neurobiologist at the University of Pennsylvania, where he, but as you'll see, he's moved on to think and write about much grander sorts of things, having to do with biology and medicine. He was a PhD student at Cornell, where he learned neuroanatomy, working on the spinal cord. When he moved to his own lab at Penn, he started working on the retina. And he expanded his experimental repertoire to include a lot of electron microscopy, serial section EM microscopy, and he provided one of the first full 3D reconstructions of the retina, really showing us the wiring diagram of the retina. And this work sounds sort of descriptive, but Peter's never been just descriptive. He was always able to sort of mine the data to come up with new ideas, often based on quantitative assessment. And he would boldly go where not a lot of other people would go. He would attempt to explain why the system is built the way it is, which is something that as biologists it's always difficult to answer why questions, but Peter always tried to answer those kind of questions based on data and based on really clever thinking. Let's see, what else was I going to say? Peter had a unique setup at Penn. Not only did he run his own lab, but he was sort of the Yoda for a very interdisciplinary group of senior scientists who worked remarkably well together to put out a lot of interesting work. I first met Peter in the early aughts, the early 2000s, where we were working on questions on the photoreceptor synapse and how it encodes information about light. And we were able to put out together electrophysiology and imaging data along with Peter's EM results to sort of explain quantitatively how information is transferred from photoreceptors downstream in the retina. And during that time, I learned a tremendous amount from Peter, not only about science, but about writing. He was sort of my mentor, and I'm not sure whether I've ever lived up to his expectations that way.
Don't answer.
Of course. Peter was won a lot of awards, including the Proctor Award from Arvo, and some awards for his writing. Regarding his writing, he was a couple of years ago, 2015, he put out his first book, which was inspired by this idea of explaining why. It was called Principles of Neural Design, in collaboration with Simon Laughlin. We had that slide up a minute ago. And he's got a new book that just came out, I think 2019, or maybe 2020.
It's this week.
This week, okay. Having to do with a term that I think he's coined called allostasis. He'll tell you much more about it. And the new book is called What is Health? Allostasis and the Evolution of Human Design. So Peter, we're very glad you're here. And
thanks, Rich. Yeah, this practice of clapping before the talk, I don't know, it's dangerous. You can't take it back at the end. It's really, I love to come to Berkeley. I just feel young again. And I would say that over the year, long career, I had a number of collaborators, and none were any more satisfying than Rich. Rich came to my lab one time and he said, here's what we're doing. Would you be interested in looking at this? And I thought, oh my God, I've been trying to do this for 10 years, and Rich is such a good experimentalist. So it was a tremendous amount of fun. And I know he liked the writing, but I know I drove him crazy too. So. So it's very, very nice to be here. I'm feeling like the Grateful Dead. I was at UCLA. I'm working my way up the coast. I'm going on to Seattle and Portland and so on. So as Rich said, I did work on very fine, detailed circuitry, And that's sort of what ultimately led to this book, Principles of Neural Design, with Simon Laughlin. And the idea was, the question that this book opens with is, how does the human brain, being far smarter than a supercomputer, you don't have to, not too dark, I think we'll be all right. How does the human brain, being smarter than a supercomputer, manage on 100,000-fold less space and energy? And so that, to answer that, you have to come up with some principles, design principles that allow this sort of efficiency. And the book lays out 10 principles, which is convenient because there are 10 commandments, 10 Bill of Rights. There were 10 originally. Yes. That mic is dead. This one. Oh, for the video. So I use this mic? I think it's better if I just talk loud. I'll try to do that. So if I'm not, wave your hands. Because I move around, the body uses 80% of an organism's total energy, and so if the brain has to be efficient, the body all the more so has to be efficient. And yet the central principle of physiology, homeostasis, which has been around for 150 years, makes absolutely no reference to efficiency. So the homeostasis is all about correcting errors by feedback. And yet, to be efficient, you need to prevent errors. So, the way it works, basically, is that the brain predicts needs and regulates all of physiology and behavior to meet these needs. Joseph Ayer and I, quite a long time ago, called this allostasis. And more recently, I've updated the story with Jay Shulkin. And we finally made a Cell Press journal with this idea. This is from Trends in Neurosciences in October. Can everybody hear me so far? Yeah, okay. So this is the book that is just coming out in the next week or something. And what it considers is, what does our species, Homo sapiens, require for a healthy life? And can we achieve this with drugs, which is the main current medical approach? And the question is, if the body and everything has to be efficient, energy efficient, why? It looks like the brain invested in things beyond foraging. The first thing. So this is a cave painting from the La Cueva de las Manos in southern Argentina. And when our ancestors charged across the Bering Straits and made their way down to the tip of Argentina, this was an early investment, 9,000 years ago, in finding the pigments and creating tools and creating the skills to paint something as gorgeous as this. And the question is, why would the brain, to be efficient, why would it make such an investment? And then the question is, well, I have my NIH biosketch to justify my my ability to write to talk about circuits, but maybe art and evolution, maybe not. But the fact is that all my life, when I would work in the lab for a while, I would also slip away to engage other things in the larger society. And so my life has sort of been an interplay between lab studies and social activities. And so the book and this talk are really the way I've lived my life. So this is my first scientific report from Cornell University. You got it almost right, Rich, but not quite. I was an undergraduate at Cornell. And then I submitted this report, and the next day I left Ithaca for Mississippi to join the Freedom Rides. So this film clip, it's a very short clip, was made on the train 10 minutes before we reached Jackson, Mississippi.
How about you? Can you give me any of your feelings?
This is me.
Want to take part in this?
Well, I want to help establish the right of all Americans to eat together and to travel together.
What do you think is your responsibility?
I think it's every American's responsibility. I only think that some are more conscious of their responsibility than others.
So 30 minutes later, we were, whoops, sorry, we were processed. Okay. The next scene is I'm in Cleveland, Ohio, at Western Reserve University in graduate school, studying corticospinal cortical brainstem projections, and I would sneak away from the laboratory from my microscope, and I was canvassing in that time in Central, which is the poorest, largest black ghetto in Cleveland. And when I would knock on doors, people would come to the door limping with their face sagging one side and their speech slurred. And I thought, well, what is this? I'd never seen this in white middle-class community where I grew up. And my professor was a neurologist, and he was studying cortical projections. These are the very projections that are damaged by stroke and cause hemiplegia and they're caused by chronic hypertension. So I was thinking, well, what is causing chronic hypertension? And maybe it's related to social tension. And I remembered that my grandfather had lived, my father grew up in this, before Central was black. It was a Jewish ghetto, and that's where my grandfather had been segregated. And he also had hypertension and early stroke. So I thought, well, maybe hypertension is related to social tension. So fast forward, as I was writing my dissertation, Cleveland ghetto erupted in riots. So fast forward to my own lab in Philadelphia, at University of Pennsylvania. I was still slipping away, but now to the library to read about the causes, social causes of hypertension, chronic hypertension, and the biological mechanisms. I was also, at this point, devouring ethnographies to learn how other people live. And then I was slipping away to Central America to visit some of these communities. And now my wife and I live for half of each year on a farm in western Panama in the mountains. And these are our neighbors, milling our sugarcane. So I now have spent 15 years living in this sort of a small community. So that's I don't have a PhD in anthropology, but this is my education. So what did I learn? Well, this is a horticultural family. The mother is here waving to us as we walk past. This is about 2 days' walk from a nearest market. And what I learned was that blood pressures in communities of hunter-gatherers or horticulturalists like this are low, and they don't rise with age. It's just flat with age, whereas and this is true for Central America, South America, Africa, Southeast Asia. This is always the case in this sort of a community. In the US, blood pressure starts to rise as children enter school. Okay, this is age, this is 6, they're just starting school. And this blood pressure continues to rise so that by graduation, 25% of boys and girls are above 140 millimeters of mercury and are in the hypertensive range. The rise, of course, is steepest for African Americans. This is caused by chronic arousal, stress, And sleep is for African Americans because, of course, in this country, black lives still don't matter. Now, this is a 24-hour record of blood pressure. So this is 12 noon, this is midnight, 12 the next day. This is arterial pressure measured by an indwelling arterial catheter. And the upper part traces are systolic, the lower are diastolic. And what this shows is that blood pressure is varying all over the place. I mean, when I saw this first time, a very long time ago, I thought, this is amazing. The doctor tells you have a blood pressure, but look at it, it's going all over. And it varies according to mental state. So for example, at this point here, the individual is in lecture. It's about 3 in the afternoon, and he's relaxed, and he's sort of dozing off, and his blood pressure goes down. At this point here, a neighbor jabs him with a pin. The brain predicts danger and wakes up his whole cardiovascular system. And then he realizes, well, it's just a prank, and it goes down. At this point, midnight, he becomes sexually aroused and has sex. And following that, his blood pressure just crashes, and he sleeps, and it goes all the way down to 50/30. You know, and then the next day in the morning, he's coping, getting his day going, taking care of his children, and his blood pressure goes up into the hypertensive range and stays there for hours. So this is allostasis, where the resources are mobilized to match the need. And the standardized, so the brain recognizes the context, predicts the need, and adjusts the pressure to match. And it provides just enough, just in time. And I'd also call your attention to the fact that there's this very wide dynamic range, and that all of the responses, all of the pressure is always responsive to what's going on. And this is what I would call health, is responsive, optimal responsiveness. So for efficiency, all biological systems adapt to predicted demand. This is true all over the brain. All synapses adapt to predicted demand. And what this means for a healthy system, arteries will adapt to the mean pressure. So for this healthy system that I showed you, where the mean pressure is around 100 millimeters of mercury, the arterial system can be, there are muscles in the arteries, and they can be modest. Where an individual has chronic prediction of need for high pressure, such as this, the mean pressure is on the order of 160 millimeters of mercury. The arterial vessels adapt just like skeletal muscles adapt to lifting weights. Arterial muscles do as well, and they thicken. And eventually, you need the high pressure simply to force the blood through this narrowed lumen. Now, people treat hypertension with drugs. And, before we get there, all these mechanisms to raise pressure are controlled by the brain. So the brain controls the kidney to increase plasma volume, or to spill, or to reduce it, which is just salt water. And the brain also controls the heart rate and force to pump this salt water through the vasculature, and it controls the arterial vessels resistance. So this is basically Ohm's law, and these are the mechanisms for operating Ohm's law in the vascular system. The brain also controls salt appetite. Now, we're often told that we eat too much salt, but in fact, if the kidney is going to control plasma volume by modulating salt water, you need a source of salt to replace it. And so as chronic arousal requires more salt water, it requires your salt appetite, your salt consumption to increase. And this is very much studied recently, how the brain operates in the hypothalamus to drive salt consumption. And there's a guy named J.P. Henry who studied this experimentally in the 70s and 80s, and he concluded that basically psychosocial arousal induces salt appetite, making a society's salt consumption a measure of its social stress. Now, you can treat these issues with drugs, but the thing is that the brain, knowing what it wants the pressure to be, predicts the need, compensates. So you can, the brain can, you can reduce plasma volume with a drug, a diuretic, but the brain speeds up the heart. So you can block the increase in heart rate with a drug, beta blocker, but then the brain increases the vascular resistance, and you can block that as well. And then you basically taken control over all of the mechanisms to modulate pressure, and you can clamp it at a certain rate, but the problem is then you can't modulate it. You can't be responsive to the changes in need. So the other thing is that all of these drugs have multiple effects. They're called side effects, but they're not really. They're known effects of other receptors for these compounds. And so, for example, beta blocker will increase blood glucose, but if you have type 2 diabetes, you're making that worse. And of course, you can treat that with other drugs for type 2 diabetes, but before very long, you get this immense, I mean, they're producing now for older people boxes with all of these different pills for each day so that you can keep track of all this stuff. And so what you end up with are individuals who are basically sick, but who are stabilized sort of precariously by polypharmacy. Now, so at this point, I'd like to shift from this sort of very low-level mechanism to talk about, more broadly, about some problems with U.S. health, and to connect those to aspects of our neural design, and then finally to comment on what to do. When I practiced this for my wife, who was also a scientist, she said, you know, this is a lot of ideas real fast, very intense. Why don't you try to calm it down? So I went for a walk. I meditated and I tried to calm it down, but I really can't. So in place of calm, I'm going to be brief. Okay, so I'm going to run through this, and then there'll be time for for questions and discussion. Okay, so here's the thing. This is age-adjusted mortality for individuals who are around 50 in the U.S., and this is death rates, and European death rates have been coming down, Canada, Australia as well, coming down steadily, and the U.S. death rate was doing the same thing, but around 1995 it started to turn back up again. Pretty dramatically. The increases in in death rate are largest for what these people, this is Case and Dayton, they're economists at Princeton. Dayton won a Nobel Prize in economics. They point out that the death rate is steepest for what they call deaths of despair, which include drugs, alcohol, and suicide. Now this cohort of U.S. whites born in 1970 and now 50, this rate is fourfold higher for males without any education beyond high school, and that includes 60% of white males. Now, this cohort is here, 1970, and this cohort crosses this 100 deaths per 100,000 at around age 45. This cohort, born in 1980, that's just turning 40 now, is crossing the same line at 35. So things are getting worse. The old folks down here are doing much better. They grew up in an easier time, but as things get worse, this curve just gets higher and faster, steeper and steeper. So the other thing that's happening is that obesity is rising dramatically over this period from what I call foods of despair, which are rich, fatty, sweet foods. And recently, we have an increase in deaths from mass shootings, which I call murders of despair. And this is a despair that gun control is not going to cure. So, I'd like to relate this, consider what causes this collective despair, and try to relate it to two features of our neural design. And the first feature is that we evolved this really huge brain. Our human brain is 3.5 times larger than the chimpanzee, which is our closest surviving relative. A chimpanzee can forage over about 6 kilometers squared. A human forager covers 12,000 kilometers squared. The chimpanzee, so this is age, and this is net production of calories per day collected by foraging, hunting, and gathering. A chimpanzee has a period of infancy where it can't do much, and then by age 5, it's feeding itself. It's gathering all the calories it needs. And it continues to improve its productivity until about age 15, in which case it's producing stuff for its offspring. Human, of course, has this huge childhood calorie sink, doesn't do a darn thing until about 15, and then only by age 20 is it beginning to feed itself. Any of you have children that age, you realize you should have very low expectations, because this is the way we evolved, not to be able to do anything at all till about age 20. And then our foraging and hunting ability is learned over a very long period of years. So you don't reach full productivity until about age 45, and then there's this slow decline with age, and beyond age 60, people are still in this stage basically feeding themselves and don't need it, are net contributors to the society. So what this means is that for 200,000 years, gathering and hunting were challenging careers that demanded long study and practice, and this gave meaning to everybody's lives. The other principle I want to mention is that there is a fundamental principle of the brain to specialize, because it saves wire and energy and space. And so the brain, human cortex has done this and has developed about 200 specialized areas in the cortex. So this is a very efficient way for computing lots of things. And once you, whoops, oh yeah. Someday I'm going to figure out how to get rid of that. Of course, once you've filled your skull with 200 areas, your cortex with 200 areas, that's it for your individual intelligence, because the skull is full. You can't expand the brain anymore. But what our species did was to give each of us 200 areas, but different ones. They're not the same. So we each have specialized our brains different from our neighbors, different from our partners, and So we each have a unique bundle, and this gives us each a unique set of abilities. And of course, you practice what you're innately good at, because that's the most rewarding thing. You know, if you're a musician, you play your music. If you're an athlete, you do that. And so this produces a community of experts: a hunter, a healer, a navigator, and so on. And this is a communal intelligence outcompetes a design where the community, everybody in the community was the same. You know, there's just no question about it. And this makes us awesome as a species, but it creates certain problems. There are costs, and one cost is mental distress. We're totally different. We're isolated from others by our very difference. And that causes problems. And the other is that there are interpersonal conflicts as well. So to benefit from this communal intelligence, we have to cooperate. We must cohere in some way. And this is achieved by what is known as sacred practice, what words alone cannot express. This is not my definition. I look. This is from Wikipedia or something, dictionary. So, what does this mean? Well, the brain invested in circuits that are very expensive, and that go way beyond foraging, because this allows us to recoup, to cooperate, basically. So, for example, when sapiens reached Indonesia, coming out of Africa, that alone was a feat. But the first thing they did 44,000 years ago was to start painting. Music is another example. These are this is from a flute from a cave in Germany 40,000 years ago. And these things probably, I mean, it's hard to. Each year, as more archaeology goes on, they find earlier and earlier examples of these things. And of course, what's not preserved is dance and drama and stories and comedy and all the other things that contribute to eliciting intense emotions of awe, grief, joy, laughter, and so on, that relieve tensions and allow cooperation. So, one consequence of this communal intelligence, it went on for several 100,000 years, is eventually there was a community of scientists and engineers that managed to create a really good steam engine. And with that, industrial production took off exponentially. And that's what is evidenced by this. This is CO2, and this is the introduction of the steam engine, and this is rising. To me, it looks like an action potential, but there's no sign of repolarization yet. And that's what's really scary. This is an explosive process, and that's why we have to do something fast. Okay? So Adam Smith was, the economist, Wealth of Nations. He was a friend and, he was a friend of James Watt, who got the patent for this thing. And Adam Smith understood already in 1776 what the threat of this was. And he said, the man whose life is spent in performing a few simple operations has no occasion to exert his understanding or exercise his invention. He naturally loses the habit of such exertion and generally becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. So he saw this problem coming 250 years ago. I think that we have not, the problem isn't, though, that we've become stupid. The problem is that we are still smart, and what we've done is to narrow the possibilities for exercising these gifts. So we evolved to explore the planet, and that's what we did. We just populated every continent. But now we punch a ticket or scan a barcode. And in the old days, for work, there were songs. As you pounded something, you sang songs. Go listen to "Brother, Where Art Thou," that tape. It's everybody is singing something. But imagine going into Walmart and everybody singing as they scan a barcode. It would be a different world, but it doesn't happen. So jobs learned in minutes or days just aren't good enough. And I think the only way these jobs are tolerable is if you're stoned. And I think it's not an accident that in these days the US is very rapidly legalizing marijuana, because I think it's a way of just dealing with some level of this despair. Of course, it's not going to solve the problem, but I think that's underlying the legalization. So it's this mismatch between our abilities and our opportunities to exercise them that I think causes this despair. So what links despair to the sort of compulsive consumption that we are familiar with? Well, for one thing, we inherited from worms, before C. elegans, the first bilateral worm had a circuit, brain circuit, for seeking food, seeking mates, salt, all of its needs, the right temperature, comfort. And each time this circuit the organism encounters something that satisfies the seeking, you get a pulse of dopamine. And so this is an illustration. This is a dopamine signal. This is these are time traces, a couple of seconds that bracket the arrival of an unpredicted reward. And so when you sum all these spikes in a histogram, you can see that every time an unpredicted reward comes, you get this pulse of spikes, you get a pulse of dopamine, and we experience the pulse of dopamine as a pulse of satisfaction that allows you to stop seeking briefly. So the problem is that the pulse dissipates and seeking resumes. Well, it's not a problem, it's the way our physiology is wired. This circuit resumes to drive you to seek to satisfy the next need. Now, foragers find food. There's still some that exist in the world. They find food unpredictably. You find a rabbit or a root or a berry, and each one you get a pulse of dopamine. They found comfort unpredictably. You find a dry cave, a warm fire, you get a pulse of dopamine. So the problem is, so they have all the frequent small pulses of dopamine, and their mean level, of course, of dopamine is pretty low, but it's enough to keep them from going crazy. We find food predictably, without any effort or without any surprise. And the problem is, it's very convenient, but the problem is that predicted rewards don't give you dopamine. When you get what you're expecting and nothing more, you don't get this. And so what you are basically is you lacking these pulses, and you get restless and you get anxious. For food, if food is predicted, the only unpredicted component to food is more than you expected and richer. So you go after larger portions, more sugar, more fat, and those drive surges of dopamine, and they also drive obesity. It's the same thing for drugs, cocaine, nicotine, amphetamines, heroin, opiates, all evoke large surges of dopamine, but since the body adapts and the brain adapts to all these things, you need more and more. You need to go from a Mac to a Big Mac to a Whopper, and then to add some cocaine on top of that. And then you need more cocaine. You know, this is what addiction is about. So what to do? So the first thing is that we're now treating a despairing population, which is obese, has type 2 diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and addictions. We're treating them at the molecular level. And of course, this is the level that was evolved 600 million years ago. These are all of these brain circuits, all of the cellular signaling circuits we had by 600 million years ago. And now we have these problems that originated 200 years ago that really aren't about these molecular levels, but we're trying to use drugs to treat them. And I say that this polypharmacy isn't even plausible as a route to health. And it's very expensive. And if we could find a route to reasonable health that didn't involve this, we wouldn't be arguing and bickering about the cost of health care. So health requires social inclusion. Number one, it means that everybody has to feel like their lives actually matter. And demonstrably, reducing inequality improves health. And there's this book that's very worthwhile reading. In fact, you can get all the material online if you just go for, Google this, spirit level. Health requires practicing our gifts across the lifespan, but automation is progressively destroying, making jobs that are terrible. And so people say we need more jobs, but it isn't more jobs we need. We need some kind of challenging activities to occupy us. And this is only going to get larger as a problem. Health requires sacred practice. We now click for the products of sacred practice: Spotify, Netflix, ESPN, Pornhub, all of these things that you can have at your fingertips, but vicarious experience can't substitute for actual participation in these activities. So the last thing is, health requires accommodating our communal intelligence. And so, for example, most of our gifts are quantitative traits governed by hundreds of genes that emerge under good conditions. So this guy, Sean Bradley, he was some of you maybe remember him. He played for the NBA. This is the distribution of height in the population. This is where he is at 7'6". And the reason he is this tall is because he's homozygous for 200 more genes for tall than for short. And he was well fed. So height is a polygenic trait, genetic trait, and it requires support from good nutrition. Well, all of our liabilities are also polygenic traits. This is all new material that's coming out in the last few years from genome-wide studies. And these are not diseases, these are conditions that emerge with poor conditions. So for example, hypertension, obesity, drug addiction, alcoholism, and various forms of madness, all including Asperger's and schizophrenia and so on, they're all polygenic traits, and they emerge under conditions most strongly of stress and despair. For example, if we replace that height distribution with despair, I think we can identify the mass shooter. Okay, that's somebody who's just way out there on the despair curve and goes nuts. Okay, so I think the point is that as physical growth requires good food, cognitive and emotional growth require nurturing for everybody on these trait distributions. I mean, most of these causes are not out here; they're in here, and so what we need to do to treat all these things is to sort of shift this whole distribution to the left, and more people will be okay. So I just want to close by saying I was at UCLA and I met this guy Dan Geschwin. Some of you may know his work, and he has a YouTube lecture that he gave to the Allen Institute on this topic, and he's one of the world leaders in this, and it's fantastic. And I urge anybody who's interested in this to take a look at his talk. So, in conclusion, Rabbi Hillel was once challenged to explain the Torah while standing on one leg, and he without hesitation he did it. Okay, so if you ask me something like that, to be brief, I would say for this book, there's a lot in this book, but the basic thing is that health can't be achieved, its responsiveness, it can't be achieved by polypharmacy. Our brain evolved to support lives of physical, cognitive, and emotional adventure, learning across the lifespan. And it's our responsibility, I think, to live such lives and to help other people live them. Thank you. So, yes.
There is 10,000 murder by fire gun in the US, and 20 people on average die by a gun in other countries. So I think the assumption that having a gun control law will not reduce the mass murders is wrong. It does work. It could prevent guns in the society. So there is a factor, 3 orders of magnitude between 20 and 10,000 in other countries. So
yeah, I agree. I mean, if we had gun control, serious gun control, we would probably reduce some of those shootings. But I think still the point is there is a level of despair here that needs to be addressed. Yeah, so I take your point.
Why do we despair more than the Europeans?
That's a okay. So that's the next question. Okay, so what does Europe know? Okay, why are
Or Australia.
huh?
Or Australia.
Yes. Okay. So here's some reasons. In Europe they have a full month or more in different countries of a paid vacation. Can you imagine what if every citizen in the U.S. had a paid vacation? This would change the country, really. They have free health care. If we had less people worrying about what they're going to do when they get something wrong, they would be better off. They have free child care. Okay. They have great public transportation. They have free college tuition or minimal college tuition. They have investment in public spaces and parks, and they exercise, walk, and cycle, and so on. So they have strong labor unions to protect them from Amazon, and all these other places. So basically, these are very simple things that really determine our level of despair and our health, and drugs are not going to cure this. Elizabeth Warren might. So vote. Marla.
So I actually want to ask you about the first part of your talk, when you were saying that the brain controls lots of these
Yes.
physiological processes.
Yes.
So I actually want to ask what you mean about that. So there's an autonomic nervous system that kicks in, and that's what maintains homeostasis. But so when you say your brain controls, how does your brain, I'm assuming you mean the non-autonomic part. How does that control the thickness of your arteries?
First of all, the autonomic nervous system has been advertised since canon, 100 years, as being for fight or flight. This is not true. I mean, it's regulating, that is as an emergency system. It's regulating every second, every bit of our condition. So the first thing, in the early 80s, when I was really studying this, I was an electron microscopist, and it was the period in which, as Beth will remember, people were looking at all the organs, and saying, what's here? And what I found was that there were sympathetic nerves on the renal, renin-angiotensin cells in the kidney. There are synapses on beta cells and glucagon cells in the pancreas. All of these things are neurally regulated, and actually the first guy to really understand allostasis was Pavlov. And if you read his description of dogs, awake dogs, behaving dogs, which he had trained, his 1904 Nobel Prize speech describes physiology of digestion. It's controlled by the brain, So all of these, and if you look up, pardon me, my 1981 paper in a very obscure place, there's hundreds of references to all of the original EM stuff, which is sort of lost now, but it's retrievable from Journal of.
Right. I mean, they have neural innervation, but those neurons originate in the brainstem, right? So I think.
Yeah, but they're controlled by the hypothalamus, which is controlled by cortex. So for example, Peter Strick, I don't know if you know, he's a neuroanatomist, who was a former student of mine, who's at Pittsburgh, who uses the rabies virus. And so he puts a virus into the kidney, he puts it into the adrenal, he puts it into the stomach, and he traces back where the synapses are from. And I mean, some of them, you know, of course, are from hypothalamus, but there's only 3 or 4 synapses back to motor cortex, sensory cortex, cingulate cortex. And so there's and this is all coming out now in PNAS and so on. High level control, multiple cortical areas controlling the kidney and the stomach. So there's just this massive evidence, but it was medical schools repeat this lie, basically, that it's the body is controlling, you know,
I
insulin.
repeat that lie when I.
Well, okay, well, read my book.
Careful.
Read my book. And I would say the book is readable by undergraduates easily. It's not a hard book. Sorry.
I've heard a lot of these types of lectures in 30 years in the School of Public Health, and yours is unusual because you offer us a new lens or a new paradigm for looking at the whole of public health. And I think evolution is, I choose the word carefully, a natural starting point for investigating many aspects of public health. And I think it's something we should teach our students. I think it's something that is very welcome, and you've demonstrated in a very eloquent way how to use it. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, yeah.
So I wonder, I mean, up here, what does Europe know? They don't have a opiate epidemic as well. You know, the rising death rates over the last 10, 20 years are sort of from, same to gun laws, or sort of these like regulation policies that are allowing poor food quality and opiates and guns. And, you know, how does that relate then to despair, or is it just sort of poor regulation?
Poor government regulation. Well,
Yeah, you know,
I mean,
poor-
well, I think it's an issue. Again, I mean, without worrying about controlling what people do, but providing people with a vacation is not controlling what they do. It's giving them a break, you know. And so many of these things are directed at making people's lives halfway reasonable for a start. You know, Europeans still go crazy; they still take drugs, but it's at a different level.
Are there other countries that this seems to be skewed? What about Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Russia, these countries? I've heard at least that Russia has very serious problems in terms of early mortality.
Sure,
and
sure,
poor health.
sure. Well, they went through a big, you know, retrograde revolution and, you know, tremendous social upheaval. And so I'm just chose these because we're talking about a stable democratic regimes. I gave it at UCLA. There was a Russian guy in the audience, and he said, well, we had all these things, and still people were being killed by Stalin, and his grandfather was killed by Stalin. So,
I heard it was more alcoholism.
well, now it is, yeah. But look, I can't cover, this is a short book, and I would say for undergraduates, it's only 170 pages. A medical student could read it in 2 nights, you know. But this is just a general pattern, and a lot of it, there's 30 pages of references, so you can, you know, expand. But I would like to show you one other point about this. This is, by the way, I was stunned to, these are migrations traced by mitochondrial genes. I was stunned to realize there's like 8 migrations across the Bering Straits. There's multiple migrations across the Panamanian Isthmus. We got to Australia in no time. We left Africa in 65,000 years ago. We got to Australia at 48, crossing the Pacific. I mean, this is us, you know. But so this is income inequality, okay? And the U.S. is the most unequal. And then there's a whole bunch of countries that are much more equal. Japan, the Scandinavian countries, and they're all better off, you know. And this plot has been made also for the states. If you plot this, this is obesity. If you plot obesity by state, you get the same plot. If you do this for mental illness, you get the same sort of thing. And and there are many countries have mental illness like fourfold less than ours. It's Japan, Germany, Spain, Italy, much better. And so this book systematically goes through health under conditions of greater equality. Yes?
So maybe this is volume 2. You make a connection between physiological mechanisms and social mechanisms.
Yes.
Now at the social level, there are gradations as well. So jumping to it, what's the state of elites? Whether that elite is anointed by the hand of God or anointed by the invisible hand, what sort of gradations are there that may work to shall we say, continue the sort of rewards that princes get from attacking each other, the unexpected reward or not, based on a very malleable underclass that may suffer from this, but is still malleable.
Well, now I think you're carrying beyond where my license goes, really. I can't, we could talk about it, but I have no authority to do this. I mean, there are a lot of economists and political scientists who think about this. Sorry.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I have a sort of a dopamine question. There was sort of these ideas of either an unexpected surprise, a good surprise, or drugs. Two ways to get a dopamine spike, and I'm wondering, there are some people I think that choose to live a pretty low stim lifestyle, and are appear joyful enough that would indicate they're getting sufficient dopamine. And I'm wondering if there's some abilities for people to rather spontaneously adapt and to create dopamine when it's necessary without either of those things.
Well, I think that all of the movements for meditation, for getting out into nature, for doing mindful activities, they bring you down off of these basically addictive things, and it takes a while to settle down. I mean, if you go on a vacation, I mean, when I used to take a month vacation, and I used to go up to Cape Cod, take my children for the summer, and I would write some, but I didn't do much, and I think it was sort of a scandal in my department. Oh, you're back. Oh, really? And when I would hit Philadelphia after a month in bare feet and sailing, I would be moving slowly, and then I would have a couple of days. So when I was on vacation, I thought I can do this, I'm okay. And we get back to Philadelphia, and I'm like, oh my God, I have tremendous anxiety for a couple of days until I got moving again. But when I got moving again, I was walking, very fast. And so, these things are modulable, but you have to pay attention to them. Rich.
In terms of despair, I just got finished reading *Sapiens*. Really.
Yes.
By Harari.
Harari, fantastic book. Yeah.
I mean, he argues that our downfall really started with agriculture.
That's right.
When we were hunter-gatherers, we didn't have to stay stuck in one place.
That's right.
We got to explore a diverse diet.
Right.
And if there was a drought, we could just move somewhere else.
That's right.
So, I mean, basically, it just sounds like the problem is civilization. We just need to, that's the downfall of civilization, is civilization. Maybe the answer is
So I was inspired by Harari's lectures and his book. And it was one of the things that made me feel I could write this book. My God, he takes these big ideas and just says stuff, and it's great, although I try to be a little more accurate than he is. But no, I mean, he's fantastic. So the story, I think, that's by the anthropologists who I respect most, point out that once you settle and exploit the land a little bit where you are, the people who are exploiting it with less efficiency just have to move off. And so if you increase your population here, you're going to reduce the game and the possibilities for living by foraging, and the people who are living that way have to move off. And so and this is our biology, So my objection to Harari is he rushes past the biology and he doesn't really discuss what is really innate about us. But it is our biology. So it's obvious that when these vigorous settlers came to America, they were just going to displace the people who were here. And of course, those people had gotten here from somewhere else. And so one of the things about migration and immigrants and so on is everybody dreams of their, this is their fatherland, but they all came from somewhere else, But it's true, this is a progressive taking over of the most productive from the less productive. And I don't think there's anything to do about it, except that now we really have to step in and it's out of hand, it's just out of control and it's destroying the planet, So, we have to do something.
How do you see the profession of doing science on this scheme? I mean, we're not Walmart workers.
No. Oh, well.
We do have the nose to the grindstone all the time, and we don't get a month of vacation usually.
That's up to you. You could.
There's a number of trainees in the room.
Yeah.
What do you say about that?
Well, I say that this period for us has been the most lucky, wonderful of 50 years of just endless support to follow our own interests, and if you make a little bit of attention to what the health, you tack some disease onto your thing, that's fine, but you get to explore. And so, of course, you look at this room, and most people are lean, and they're active, and they're sober. And I walked around Stanford campus, and my God, it's just everybody is just healthy as can be. But you can't find a homeless person there, and you wouldn't even know that they existed. So I think the problem is we have been very fortunate, and I'm hoping, people will actually go out and try to make this for everybody. Roland.
Clinton was president in '95, I think.
Yeah,
and that curve picked up.
Yes.
So I think in this country, even the left has failed.
Oh, yeah. Well, he wasn't left. I mean,
Well, no,
yeah. I mean, I loved him. I loved to listen to him because he could cry, and I just loved it, But no, things got worse, and the inequality has been rising
but my
since.
point is that even the left in this country has completely failed.
Yeah, well.
That was the Gingrich. That's what happened in 1995 or whatever.
Yeah.
Like when there was that revolution. That Gingrich.
Thank you all for coming. I know people have to leave, so I'll stick around, but